This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2-3 page essays on the themes of Masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is part 3 of flyer number 403, entitled Masculist Public Anger. Carrying straight on. Bullet. The Masculists will force women to fib up. We men have the financial power, since nearly all of us are fips. We are socialized to be fips, and even evolved to be fips, so we don't need to parasite off the labor and money of a woman in order to survive the way women did off men a century ago. We have the power to force women to fib up, whether women like it or not, since a fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into some gullible, stupid manslave. But thanks to the Masculist and MGTOW movements, the supply of such gullible, stupid manslaves is drying up, as Masculist and MGTOW video creators like myself educate millions of young men not to accept being manslaves and to expect women to fib up or to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at. Young men at high school can reject young women who choose to study fluffy crap majors, so that these young women then doom themselves to become fluffy parasites as adults. Masculists want the establishment of masculist groups in every high school and campus, so that young men are in a position to put enormous moral pressure on young women to fib up or pay a horrible price, namely not getting a man and being rejected from society, by being accused of being a hated manslaver by both sexes, certainly by masculists and also by female masculists, both of whom see fluffy manslavery as a moral abomination. Bullet. The Masculists will men-fair the gender laws. Once there are enough Masculists, they can then push for the men-fairing of the gender laws, for example, reforming the divorce courts, as mentioned above, legislating the para, removing many gender-oppressive laws against men, etc. Probably the push for the legislation of the para, given how deeply women expect that men exist on this earth to pay for women to have babies, will prove in historical terms to be as big a fight for men as was the fight for the right to vote for women. Legislating the para will force women to grow up, to fib up, to take responsibility for their own lives, and not to expect, fluffy style, to rely on a man to solve her existential problems. The prospect of the legislation of the para terrifies fluffies. They will fight it tooth and nail. Bullet. Masculists will crush feminazi arrogance with masculist science. Masculists, particularly masculist scientists like myself, are utterly fed up with the assignate, innumerate, PC-based ignorance of most feminists, who use feminism rather like a religion, preaching to women what women desperately want to hear, now that women have been forced to adopt the traditional male role of being a careerist. Brackets, quote, "Now that women can work, they must work," is one of the major slogans of the Masculists, remember, in bracket. These is cyanate, that is, ignorant of science, unable to think scientifically. Feminists are telling women that they are as capable as men, that anything a man can do, a woman can do. It's true that the performance score distributions of men and women overlap to a large extent, but not at the top end of the performance scale, where men dominate due to men's 10% larger brains, men's 4 IQ point higher average IQ, men's 10% higher IQ variance, that is, men's IQ scores are more spread out and women's more bunched up over a whole population. Men's 10 times higher testosterone levels, making men a lot more aggressive, ambitious, dogged, persistent, so achieve hugely more than wishy-washy women, so that at the top end, men win 99% of the science Nobel Prizes. Women evolve to be baby factories and child raisers, which is obviously essential but not status-worthy, since any woman can do those things. The feminists are desperately trying to convince themselves and women as a whole that women are men's equals. No, they aren't, not at the top end. Masculist scientists, like myself, are fed up with this silent, innumerate feminist lies concerning women's abilities, so we use masculist science, such as the above, to crush feminist PC bullshit whenever we come across it. Increasingly, as these is-cyanate feminists sprout their is-cyanate garbage, the more vociferous we masculists harangue them in public meetings, forcing them to stop spreading their ignorant garbage. If the monoconscious feminists get particularly nasty and verbally violent, then we angry masculists merely ratchet up our own anger and vitriol, and since we masculists are males, we have 10 times the testosterone levels than women, so can be as verbally violent as we like, and with the conviction that we masculists have masculist science on our side, which is hugely more powerful and convincing than the cyanate fairydom of feminist PC dogma. Bullet. Masculists will force society to become bi-conscious. This decade, the 2020s, is the decade of men's lib. Now it's our turn to liberate ourselves from the manslavery of fluffies and the atrocities committed against men in the fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts. We masculists will set up masculist groups in every high school and college, preaching our masculist ideas to students, to the media, to society. We will change the gender laws. We will change society so greatly that future historians will look back and see that the rise of masculism in the 2020s was as historically important as the rise of feminism in the 1970s. We masculists will force society to become bi-conscious by teaching it masculist ideas, so that nearly everyone becomes familiar with them due to the uptake of masculist ideas by the media, who then transmit these ideas to the masses, the millions, the billions. Second wave feminism has been around for half a century now, in brackets, whose birth I witnessed as a young adult when I was an avid male feminist, hoping that feminism would remove the awful housewifey vapidity of my mother's generation. But that never happened, since I learned that women have 10% smaller brains than men, so will never be capable of matching the best of the men. Close brackets. There will be a flood of Masculist and MGTOW books over the next few years, and men's studies courses will pop up like mushrooms across the universities of the planet. This very masculist flyer will be collated with 400 plus others in my own men's studies textbook, for example. A few years from now, the average Joe or Jane in the street will be as familiar with masculist ideas as feminist ideas, so by definition will have become truly bi-conscious. When nearly everyone is bi-conscious, the monoconscious fluffy feminist hypocrisy that manifests itself in the divorce courts, etc., will be swept away by new gender laws that are fair to both sexes. A bi-conscious society will be much nicer to live in for men, but will force women to fip up and to grow up, which will threaten a lot of women who prefer to remain child-minded and dependent on the manslavery of men. Bullet. Masculists will force the journalists to spread masculism. One way the masculists can force the journalists to take up masculist ideas is to threaten the government with population extinction by men continuing to boycott marriage and paternity, telling governments to push the journalists, in brackets, who at the current time are deeply monoconscious and profoundly biased against masculism, thinking deludedly that sexism is a one-way street, close brackets, to present the public with the masculist case. However, I think it's more likely that the journalists themselves, especially the male journalists, will simply pick up masculist ideas as intrinsically interesting due to their profound historical importance and impact on society, affecting the lives of billions of people across the planet. Bullet. Masculists will wipe out, annihilate fluffies and fluffy feminists. By creating a FIP society, by men-fairing the gender laws, by putting enormous moral pressure on high school girls, fluffies and his fluffy feminists will die out. They will convert themselves into bi-conscious feminists, admitting that gender oppression is a two-way street, thus losing their monoconscious bias and hence their feminist anger at men for the way that men oppress women, which gets countered by a corresponding masculist anger at how women oppress men. Bi-conscious women are much less feminazi bitchy to men, since they see that women oppress men too. So their feminist anger at men is cancelled by their female masculist anger at women. Bi-conscious feminists Bi-conscious feminists are much more approachable by men, so are much more likely to have boyfriends, so are not deprived, as monoconscious feminists are increasingly, of sex, love and babies, once the gender laws have been men-faired, so that young men are prepared to be fathers again. Close brackets. In a FIP society, where the gender laws had been men-faired, fluffies and fluffy feminists will have died out, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and utterly pariahed. It will be a miserable existence to be a fluffy parasite or a fluffy feminist hypocrite a decade from now. We will see millions of monoconscious feminists convert themselves into bi-conscious feminists, or they will be spat at by both sexes, as the masculists tell young women that the main reason they cannot persuade quality young men to give them their sperm is due to the toxicity of the divorce courts, taken over by the hated fluffy feminist hypocrites who have made divorce and hence marriage and paternity so toxic for men that young men refuse to give desperate young women their sperm. Fluffies and fluffy feminists will be so spat at for being manslayers and hypocrites that very few of them will survive. Most will have converted to stay sane and not be rejected by society. Bullet. Masculists will push the vision of a bi-conscious world. The concept of bi-consciousness is obviously, given the above, very important to the masculists. Those monoconscious feminists who close-mindedly reject bi-consciousness are labelled MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, by the masculists. And this is a term of real abuse coming from the bi-conscious masculists. It will be used heavily by the masculists in the coming years to hurl back at feminazi bigotry. The more vociferous the monoconscious feminazis become, the even more vociferous and hateful will the masculists become to crush them. Bi-conscious masculists don't deny that men oppress women, but heftily deny the claim of monoconscious feminazis that gender oppression is a one-way street. Masculists know that gender oppression is very much a two-way street and merely crush monoconscious feminazi bigots with their masculist ideas and their masculist science. Masculists aim to see the death of monoconscious feminism, forcing it to become a historical relic. So, summarising a bit, expect in the coming few years a much higher degree of masculist public anger as the masculists close their ranks and begin to verbally harangue the feminazis, destroying the fluffy parasites and the fluffy feminist hypocrites, men-fairing the gender laws, bringing in the para, pushing society to become a FIP society that is made bi-conscious. For all this to take place, masculists will need to become publicly angry to generate the collective energy of men to achieve these historically important goals. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, and e-textbook of 400 plus masculist flyers for men's studies courses. Freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.